Kyle, you had the opportunity to interview a rabbi. And can you tell us how this came about? This is crazy.
This is a really interesting turn of events. When I was down in Seattle for PodCon this past December, I was part of this networking group. I decided I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to see all these different podcasters from around North America and the rest of the world. And I was sitting at this table talking about what Assumptions was all about. And the lady that was sitting across from me said, "Oh, you should talk to my rabbi." So her name was Julie Kinn. She has a PhD and is in the research and clinical psychologist for the American military. And they're actually starting to do their own podcasting and trying to, educate people coming back from war on the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health and stuff like that too. So they were there just to understand how to make more exciting podcasts, basically. Right. And so it was just kind of this interesting intersection. Once I came back to Calgary, I reached out to her and said, "If you remember, we were at this group. I'd love to talk to your rabbi." And she said, "Yeah, Rabbi Seth is awesome." And so then I had the chance to talk to him.
Yeah, what was that like? I mean, we'll hear the conversation, but just...
It was really, really fun. I think what you'll actually hear a little bit with me talking with him, as stilted as it is at the very beginning, is that as much as I have been taught about the Jewish faith, I don't think I really understood the Jewish faith a lot. And he was able to fill in a lot of holes and really educate me on exactly what is important to a Jewish upbringing and to a Jewish community. Yeah. And I just really, really enjoyed our conversation on two levels. I just thought it was a good conversation, but also that it really taught me a little bit for being so into the Christian upbringing of my life and understanding how that all worked. To see it from a different point of view is really interesting.
Yeah, you're ready to convert.
I was ready to convert. Yeah, that's right. I say that. Right. I think in one of our conversations we had, say that.
And he's actually a fan of our show too, which is always encouraging.
That's right. That's right. We only actually invite people on that have said nice things about us.
Yeah,
so
we have a special form you have to sign.
If you want to come on.
Yeah. You have to share it with 5 friends minimum.
That's right.
I was not able to be part of this interview. I'm bummed about that. Would have loved to have been part of this discussion, but really thankful for Rabbi Seth's time. And I actually haven't listened to it yet. I will obviously be listening to it as we work on publishing these interviews, but I'm excited to hear how that conversation goes. Seth Goldstein is a rabbi at Temple Beth. Oh gosh, I did not practice this pronunciation. Hatfiloh. I'm butchering that. Temple Beth Hatfiloh, and he serves the Jewish community in Olympia, Washington. He is a fellow of Rabbi Without Borders. He blogs monthly at a blog called My Jewish Learning, and he is the president of Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and was honored to be named one of 2016 America's most inspiring rabbis by the magazine Forward.
He was definitely inspiring to me.
That's right. Well, we're looking forward to this conversation.
I fall down to my knees. Eyes are raised to the sky.
Let's start with this here then. I'm very interested. Actually, first, could you introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Seth Goldstein. I'm a rabbi, and I serve a congregation in Olympia, Washington.
Great. I'm very curious, what was it that made you decide to become a rabbi? What put you on that path?
It's a great question, because I think that it's almost like what originally brought me to it is different than what sustains me in it. So I always find that to be an interesting question. What brought me to it? I mean, I was always, I was raised in a very involved Jewish household, originally from New York. And I always found value through that, through my family connections, through the celebration of the holidays, through connections with peers and my community, and was educated that way and found a lot of richness in that. What's interesting in retrospect, and then and following that through, when I went away to college, I sort of drifted in and out of my connections with Judaism and Jewish community. And when I was in college, I drifted away a little bit, wanting to do some more exploration. I eventually found my way back, and didn't really decide to become a rabbi until I was an adult. I worked in journalism for a little bit. I worked in government for a little bit, but I was always drawn to the teachings and the stories and the structure of Judaism. And I had found a lot of value in that personally. And so I was drawn to essentially to become a teacher of it, to be able to help connect others to it who might also find meaning in that. And I decided to pursue the rabbinate, thinking that that would be a good way to do it, not necessarily knowing exactly when I started what would or what community I'd be working in or what population I'd work with. But I eventually, as I made my way through seminary, found my way to the pulpit and have been working with a congregation ever since. And so it's been, it's almost like what drew me to it was less about theology per se or about spirituality. It's interesting. I almost deepened my sense of spirituality after I became a rabbi. But it was the sense of the notion of structure, of tradition, of stories, of that way of being able to frame our lives and the value in building community and interpersonal connections is what drew me to it. I mean, now I'm sustained by it through more theological exploration, issues of justice and social justice, and the moral voice that can be brought to bear. But those all wrap up in how I identify and pursue what I do.
That's great. Yeah, it does sound like that community aspect was important for you. What do you find the most rewarding about your job currently?
What I find most rewarding about my job is the ability to connect with people. I mean, I think that I really, one of the things that I serve, so currently I serve a congregation, and I've been with the same congregation for about 14, 15 years now. And one of the most rewarding things about that is that I've been able to really grow with people, and that they, as they've gotten older and gone through different life cycle events or changes in their lives, that I've been able to accompany people along that journey and to be a sense of support, stability, whatever, or just growth with a person. It's interesting now. So we have in the Jewish tradition, we have the ritual of bar or bat mitzvah. So when a child turns 13, it's a coming of age ceremony in which they sort of grow into their Jewishness and take on a different ritual status, as it were. We call it becoming a Jewish adult. They can't, drive or vote or things like that, but there's a sense of spiritual growth in that. And so having been in a congregation now for 14, 15 years, the kids that are going through bar bat mitzvah are the ones who were born while I was here. And so being able to see that growth and to be with families through that has been really rewarding. And it's one of the things that sustains me. I mean, one of the flip side of that is that you end up having to bury people that you love, because people who are part of the congregation and who had been older, that you've gotten to know and to connect with and to guide, pass on. And so then you people that you've really been in deep relationship with, that are even outside, my personal circle or family, but who I serve in this capacity, have passed on, and I've officiated at their funerals. And so that has been, it's very difficult, but it's also very rewarding to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that from your perspective, because you've been there for so long, seeing that kind of circle of life, like people being born, people passing away, but people coming into their own as well. You get to kind of see all those stages of life. I have to admit, I have a very small exposure to like synagogue and synagogue life. However, from what I understand, like there's great priority given to different community events like eating and learning and celebrating different things together. Do you think there is anything that's specifically different about the Jewish way of life than there is in even modern society?
It's interesting. I think that there is a strong emphasis on communal connection and relationship within Judaism, even coming from the sort of earliest theological ideas embedded in Torah or Scripture. This idea of covenant, right? So this idea of covenant, which is essentially a contract, right? An agreement between parties, and that for me serves as the basis for Jewish theology. This idea that we're in a covenant with God, or we're in a covenant with the divine. But what that means is that if you're in covenant with, if everybody is in, or not everybody, if the group is in covenant with the same thing, then they're in covenant with each other. So there's a connection with each other as well, because they're in the same. I don't say God is up there, but just for the sake of demonstration, if we're in a vertical covenant with the divine, then we're also in a horizontal covenant with everybody else who's in that relationship as well. And so I find that to be very compelling as an idea of what of a theological basis for this idea of being in relationship, and how that plays out then is how Judaism is practiced is based around that. I mean, fundamentally, when we have a worship service, for example, we have the idea of a minyan, which is this essentially, while you can pray individually and you can have a worship service with less than 10 individuals, you cannot have a full or complete prayer service unless you have 10 individuals. So there's and so that's a minyan. So 10 Jewish adults is considered a minyan, and there are certain ritual aspects that you can't carry out unless you have that minyan. And what those are, I think, are also somewhat compelling. One of them is the public reading of Torah in a ritual fashion. So we read scripture as part of worship. It's not uncommon in other faith traditions, but there's a ritualistic ceremonial way of doing it. But if you don't have 10, then we don't do it. Another is the recitation of the morning prayer. Now, MOURNING, so prayers for mourners who are grieving lost ones. There's a special prayer recited by those who are in mourning, but we don't do it unless there are 10 present. And I think that is a very compelling statement about the need for community, that you can't do this on your own. You can't connect with our sacred text on your own. You can't mourn fully in a way. I mean, you can mourn. I don't want to discount that, but in public, you need to have that support. I think that's very compelling, and I think related to what you were asking about the connection to modernity, I think that there is I think, and it's not exclusive to Judaism, I think that a lot of religion is sort of countercultural in the sense that at least in our modern society, we have a strong emphasis on individuality and individual pursuits and individual rights. And I think that I don't discount that. I live within the American context as well, and I value that. At the same time, seeing where my spiritual teachings inform me in the need to balance that with communal responsibilities. And that to me is fundamental to my spiritual and religious outlook.
That's great. I guess then going off of that, meaning that we value community, or that you value community absolutely, and that ceremony piece is so important. Is there a role for quote unquote the singles in the synagogue? Meaning, like, if someone isn't part of a family unit and is just coming there by themselves, how do they integrate into the community as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question on multiple levels. On the one hand, there's no difference, right? You don't, to be part of this minyan or a prayer community or a spiritual community, nobody has to be partnered or married. Individuals have the same standing or status as anybody else, regardless of marital status or partner status. I think what is interesting, though, and this is a challenge that I think we do, not because of any spiritual teaching or whatnot, but I mean, there is an emphasis. Well, scratch that. I think that there is also at the same time an emphasis on this idea of passing down the faith, passing down traditions from generation to generation, and therefore putting an emphasis on family, on children, and I think for good practical reasons, right? That's how it's going to continue. But I think that sometimes we end up in congregational life almost putting too much emphasis on that at the expense of people who are not. And that I think is our challenge. I think we want to uphold that and honor families. We welcome children. We celebrate marriages, and we see in that the continuation of the tradition. There's even embedded in teachings about teaching your children about this. It's found in Scripture. The Passover Seder, for example, is built around this idea of teaching children the story of the Exodus and the rituals behind it. And so that there is definite value in that. I think that it is our challenge to recognize the diversity within our communities and to not necessarily privilege one over the other, even though that has been the default. So I recognize it as a challenge to where I know people who may not have felt welcome in community just because the emphasis has been on families or kids or partnering, and not in a conscious exclusion sense, but in the opposite of too much emphasis on type thing. So I think it's a valid critique that I think we need to address, because really ultimately at the base nobody is any different, and everybody has the same status as within spiritual community.
Talking about marriage here, then, there was a conversation Daniel and I were having the other day about how we were recognizing that marriage is obviously still happening, but there doesn't seem to be a rush to get married anymore like there was in previous generations where, I just need to get married and start a family, and that's just what we do in our society. And nowadays, people seem to be getting married a little bit later. There is a specific dedication, or more dedication, I find with fathers taking a much more interest in their kids, at least what we saw, like in the 50s, 60s, and stuff like that. I guess in your view, is there still that rush and pressure to get married in the Jewish church, or is that seemingly changing as well?
Yeah, I think that I think that I think that Jewish community is not. I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum, so I think that we are susceptible to those trends as well. I don't see that a rush to get married as we might have seen it in previous generations. Well, at the same time, I think that an upending of a lot of traditional norms and roles have shifted, and I think that this has been part of that. So that in and of itself is another interesting. I don't want to say the word challenge. It's an opportunity to sort of think about how we do spiritual community and what that means if it's not going to be based around this norm that when you're in your 20s you get married and have your kids and then you grow, and to see that change across the board, and to recognize that there are people who are opting to delay marriage or not get married, or to live in partnership without that label of marriage or whatnot. That just adds to a different level of diversity within our communities that I think that we need to address. And it's not. I don't see it as a stepping away or a negative, but I do see it as an opportunity. What I do see that's kind of interesting as well, in that I always pick up when I get my newspaper on Sundays I flip through the marriage listings. I'm always interested to see how many people, and it seems like more and more, although it's not a scientific analysis, are, when they do get married, also opting for alternative forms of marriage per se. So in the sense that they're not just going to their rabbi or their pastor or their minister to get married, and not even going to judges anymore for purely. So I mean, there's a lot of this sort of DIY marriage where friends are marrying friends. They are doing, getting the online ordination, or some states in the U.S. I know allow for you to apply for like a one-day, official sanction to perform a marriage, and so that seems to be happening more and more, where the officiant is less a religious figure, a traditional religious figure, than something alternative. And so I'm not sure what that means for spiritual community as a whole. I've just been noticing that as a trend.
I'm just impressed that you still go and buy a newspaper.
Yeah, just once a week. I only get the Sunday paper. That's
right.
Everything else is online.
Is dating different for the devoutly Jewish, or are there unique aspects that Jewish people end up dealing with that others don't?
I should say that I locate myself on the more liberal of Judaism, Jewish practice, and so I can't speak for orthodoxy as well outside of my own observations of it. But I think that part of there's sort of this dichotomy between challenge and opportunity, I think, with dating is the sort of sense of me, or like trying to date or to marry within the faith among Jews. And I think that stems not just from it stems in part from theological basis, in the sense of how Judaism is transmitted, because there is an aspect to bloodline transmission within Judaism. So then who you marry might have import, and also too, I think, just culturally, the sense of Jews being a minority faith tradition, and therefore exhibiting a lot of the characteristics or concerns of ethnic minorities, about wanting to preserve that the tradition. And so seeing over the years, I mean, one of the major questions that has been raised within Jewish community is this idea of intermarriage, of Jews who are marrying people who aren't Jewish, and what that then means for Jewish continuity and Jewish tradition. And I think that looking over the past couple decades, the attitudes have shifted, in the sense that where it was really strictly taboo and you didn't really see it at all, in the 50s and 60s, Jews marrying outside the faith or even dating was frowned upon. Over the years, you've seen that shift a bit, in the sense that maybe it has to do with more acceptance or more integration into larger community, or seeing that it is not, or as it plays out over time, that it's not the end of Jewish continuity. Right? We've seen that people have been able to transmit Jewish tradition through the family to their kids, even if one of the parents is not Jewish. And so within me and my colleagues, we sort of come to, not across the board, but have come to different ideas around that, and seeing that it's not, that on one hand, people are going to date who they're going to date, and we could promote Jewish identity and Jewish continuity, but yet we also want to be open to include people who end up partnered with somebody who isn't Jewish as the means of the continuity piece. So it's so I think that has shifted as well. And I mean, I remember when I was younger, getting the message that, you know, I shouldn't date anyone who wasn't Jewish because you don't know where it's going to lead, and that sort of thing, and whatnot. But I think that's I'm sure that still exists, but I think it's continually softening, because we're recognizing the realities of Jewish community, and also that they're not mutually exclusive. So, and valuing, putting the emphasis not on who you are dating, right, but the emphasis on just the value and richness of Jewish tradition, so that it's meaningful for a person who then would want to pass it along or live it out in their family life and their adult life, because of its inherent value, not just because you're trying to preserve something that doesn't have meaning.
Right. That's really interesting. This is completely from my own knowledge here then. If I wanted to, could I convert to Judaism?
Yes. Yeah. So Judaism, right. There is a lineality by birth that Judaism gets transmitted, but there is conversion. People can convert to Judaism. Judaism welcomes conversion. We don't proselytize per se. We don't go out and seek converts, right, as a matter of our faith tradition, but people can convert, and when they do, they're considered just as fully Jewish as anybody else. I mean, a metaphor I like to use sometimes when I talk about it is around the idea of citizenship, right? So citizenship in a country, you can become a citizen in two ways. You can be born a citizen, or you can naturalize. And so it's somewhat similar. You can be born Jewish, but you could also naturalize. You can convert, and the processes are in some ways similar as well. You have to go through a period of living in community with your green card, or the equivalent in Canada, I guess, and then then you have to live in the area for a while. You have to study, right, and pass a test of basic knowledge, and then you go through a ritual. And so it's somewhat similar in terms of what conversion to Judaism looks like. That it's because I think, again, of the communal aspect and the lived aspect of Judaism, as opposed to it being subscription to a particular dogma or creed, that when one converts to Judaism, they go through this process of living and learning. So of living in Jewish community, of practicing, of taking on the practices and studying Jewish history, traditions, liturgy, whatnot. And then after a course of study, will then be welcomed into the Jewish people.
Yes, this is Kyle breaking into the conversation once again. As always, Assumptions is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. If you haven't gone to the Alberta Podcast Network's website, there are so many great shows to listen to. Shows like That's a Thing, Best Wrestling, That's So Maven, and one of our newest members to the network, Mess Hall. This is a weekly podcast where Avery Cochran talks to comedians about food. My three favorite things. The top two spots are food. Check out all the great shows by going to albertapodcastnetwork.com. Secondly, we're helped out by ATB. This week I want to highlight something called Boostr. That's BOOSTR. This is a reward-based crowdfunding platform. So think about this. Does your business need a boost, or are you looking to boost a local company? You can check out Boostr from ATB, a unique way to crowdfund and support local businesses and get special offers from the companies. Designed by Albertans for Albertans, businesses get support from advisors and the community. Visit atbbooster.ca. That's booster without the E. Who couldn't use a boost? I do want to thank everybody for listening here this week. We have 2 more episodes of interviews before Daniel and I return to discuss the entire season and what we learned. You still have time to send in your feedback and comments to assumptionspod@gmail.com. Please do. A few of you have already done so, and it's been so great to receive them. But for now, let's get back to the conversation. No, that's fascinating. I never heard that analogy before, but that makes a whole lot of sense. Like the idea of like a country or a nation. Switching gears a little bit here, I'm curious if like how broadly different sexualities are welcomed into the Jewish culture? Like, are they, and do they have a role?
So in terms of, let me just clarify the question. So you mean
Yeah,
the
yeah.
role in terms of what, I mean, is Judaism welcoming of
Yeah, like about like
LGBT?
homosexuals or like different sexualities.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Judaism has been, or at least in contemporary times, I think as we've recognized the differences in sexuality and even gender identity now has been as societal attitudes have changed around those as a whole. Judaism has as well, in the sense that we've at least within the more liberal progressive sides of Judaism, that where I locate myself, has been fully welcoming of people of different sexualities, gender identities, and whatnot, as breaking down of which involves, you know, a rethinking of those traditional roles. And Judaism, at least from the liberal progressive end, has fully embraced different sexualities and gender identities as part of not just in a sense of a acceptance of changing norms from outside, but I think that also just internally, the idea that we as individuals are, as we teach, created in the image of God, who carry with them a sense of the divine spark, regardless of sexuality, orientation, gender identity, and, you know, a whole host of identities. And so wanting to value that and uplift that. So Judaism has embraced that. And again, it's sort of gone with the, not to say that it was always there or inherent within Judaism, just as it hasn't been within other faith communities or expressions, but it's been an ongoing process, because we do see within the scope of Judaism itself, those on the more traditional end of things have been slower to embrace that as well, because of seemingly contradictions with traditions or teachings or whatnot. So you know, I think that it's really interesting as a whole, so related to some of what we've been talking about, that as I think religious traditions, Judaism included, aren't isolated in that as well. And I think that we're always engaged with the larger cultural conversations that we're having in our greater communities, and then we sort of locate ourselves within that, either embracing change, providing a guiding voice, sometimes counteracting trends that are, especially political trends that seemingly work against spiritual teachings. But there's always that conversation I see, and I think that the ones about equality, especially around sexuality and gender identity, is one that's been fully in line with how I understand my Jewish teachings to be, what tradition teaches us.
Okay, so we're going to segue now into maybe the most awkward part of the conversation, which is what would you say is the purpose of sex in the Jewish worldview?
I mean, I think the purpose of sex is twofold. It's one, to procreate. You know, I think that's you know, I don't discount that aspect to it. There's right from the get-go, we're told to be fruitful and multiply. I don't see that as I see that as a core teaching, that this idea, and not just in the sense that we're all supposed to have children, because I know there are people who don't, either by choice or by factors that aren't their choice. So I don't want to hold that up above that. I'm not trying to create a hierarchy, but I think embedded within tradition that this idea of procreation, of being able to populate the world beyond us as a means of continuing the world, humanity, in my case specifically Judaism, Jewish teachings. I think that's important. And I think especially with this chain of how we interact across the generations, where, as we'd like to see, where generations can take care of those older than them and younger than them, and that chain continues of support, not just outwardly among the people that we are in community with at any one given time, but throughout the generations, I see to be really important. So sex is procreation, and again, it's not to say that we can't support children and the development of children in other ways, that either through teaching or supporting families or whatnot, for those who choose not to have children and don't have children themselves. But that idea, I see that as a sense of continuity, and sex plays into that. But there's also, I mean, within Judaism, there's also the idea that sex is pleasurable, and that it's a part of who we are. It's a part of our desires, our needs to be sexual beings and to engage in sex. And even from earliest teachings, we see that. I'm thinking about after the Bible, some of the later Jewish teachings that promote the idea of sex, even so much so that sex on the Sabbath is seen as a special blessing, because you're taking this idea of the day of rest, the sacred day, that you're augmenting it with pleasure. And I think that it's not to say that there aren't norms and guidelines around sex, and that it's not sex just for the sake of sex, but I think we think about sex within the context of loving, respectful relationships. But no, sex is up there.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it similar to Christianity, where sex is supposed to be reserved for the marriage, or not necessarily?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I think that I think the way I understand it, and again, this is just me, I'm not going to speak for others. I don't know of any exclusive taboo of outside of. I mean, I think in ancient traditions there were issues around if a child was born out of wedlock, then the status of that child could be questionable. But I'm not extremely well versed on that. But what I see in that, and the way I understand that, is that sex is something that is best carried out when it's in the context of a loving and respectful relationship, right? Where two people approach each other from a place of respect for each other, for themselves, and that it's not an abusive thing. It's not based on power. It's not based on treating another person like an object. And so when I read that about reserving sex for marriage, what I read into that, or how I understand it, is that marriage is meant to be, it doesn't always turn out that way, but marriage is meant to be that type of relationship where you have two people who form a deep emotional, spiritual partnership with deep respect for one another, and therefore the sex within that relationship reflects that. Can that happen outside the bounds of marriage? Yeah, I think so. So for me, it comes down to upholding sex in those contexts. Outside of, sex in an abusive relationship is not something we want to uphold. Sex within a use by power, people using sex for various means, it's not that's not what I want to promote as a healthy sexual relationship within a spiritual context. But to be able to give expression to love for one another in that in the context of one relationship through sex is a means of, I think, deepening that connection and showing respect for one another. That's how I understand that. sex prohibition. I even stopped saying when I've done teaching around it. We had this term premarital sex. Like, what is the feeling of premarital sex? Well, I've even shifted around that to just talk about non-marital sex, because premarital sex implies that you're going to eventually get married, which may not be the case. But to think about sex in the non-marital sex in the same context, that again has to do with respect and care and love for oneself and another, that could be a very rich and meaningful sexual relationship.
I guess I'm curious, and maybe this is more talking more about my past and upbringing than anything else, but in your role of being a counselor and talking to the members of your community, how would you counsel someone, maybe even going through their bar mitzvah, who struggles with sexual guilt? Is there a way that you talk about that with them?
Sexual guilt in what way?
In what way? Like, again, this is me. Like, I mean, when I was growing up, I was kind of under the impression, just watching culture and stuff around me, that sex was only reserved for certain people, and that if I was having certain thoughts or impulses, that was inherently wrong. So I suffered a lot, I think, growing up, thinking, oh, all these things I'm having are like, there's something wrong with me. I don't know if there's that same thing that happens for the youth in the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, interesting. I think about messages that I got when I was growing up too, about sex reserved for marriage. Just so I heard that the same way. And I think recognizing, I mean, you run the risk, right, of saying if you just promote that, then of inculcating guilt, right, in people, or defiance, right? It's sort of like a rejection of specifically. And so I want to sort of meet people where they are, and I think that sexual norms have changed in a way, and that's why I talk more about this idea of treating people as a subject and not an object, and with respect, right? And I think a lot of the things that I think that we would talk about, and we're talking about what a healthy sexual relationship looks like, is ones that I want to frame in that spiritual context as well, because I see that as those are spiritual values, right? Treating people as whole individuals as opposed to just objects, sexual objects or whatnot. That for me is a spiritual value. The idea of being of respect, of honoring a person as a reflection of the divine. That to me is a spiritual value. And when we I think we want to be realistic in terms of thinking about sexual norms as they are, but we want to infuse those, what I want to do is infuse those norms with those spiritual values. So it's not that we're saying an either or, that if you do this, you're fine, and if you do this, you're wrong, and therefore, right, feeling those feelings of guilt that I can completely understand. But that look at what you're doing, the opportunities that you have, where you find yourself in relationship with other people, and you have a choice to make about how you treat that relationship, and my hope is that they make the right choices around it, because that I think is going to be best for the other person, best for them, and best for their the relationship between the two.
Well, taking that relationship further, then, why is that commitment to marriage so important?
Well, I don't want to exclusively hold out marriage as the ideal, right? In the sense that, going back to, as we were talking earlier, this idea about wanting to honor everybody in their life choices and decisions and where they are, so not to hold up one over the other. But I found marriage, when it's done well. And I think about my role as a rabbi and also my own experience, that it's really about partnership. It's about being able to be a support for one another. It's about being going back to child rearing. It makes things easier, at least in terms of how marriage has been evolving in terms of more of a partnership as opposed to more segregated roles within the relationship. But I find it to be I mean, I think I find marriage to be, and again, for speaking personally, for me in terms of my own, because I'm married, that it's, I mean, it's a real, it's a spiritual practice in a way. This idea of commitment and humility, in the sense that you're not the primary. I mean, you are a partner to this, but you also have a partner that you're meant to support, and that sometimes means not. That sort of means compromise. This idea of compromise and sort of figuring out, and sometimes you're lifted up, and sometimes your partner is lifted up, and being able to have a built-in support system for difficult times, and also a cheerleading squad when things are going well. I find that to be, for me, has been a really powerful aspect of marriage. Can these things be found outside the context of marriage specifically? Sure, I think so. But for me, I still find value in the institution because of that, you know, and I think it has to work well. And I think that when I see that people, when I work with couples who are getting married, or at least, or maybe sometimes having challenges in their marriage, I try to impress upon them that it is this idea of it's a, you know, give and take, that it's not just, it's about really honoring the other person as much as yourself, and that there's this, it's you're forming this third thing, right? There's two individuals, but then you have this third thing, which is the marriage, that you that requires humility, compromise, courage, risk taking, recognizing that you're not the primary at all times. And to me, those are spiritual values.
Yeah, we started this conversation talking about community, and specifically we were talking about how, like, that minyan, that group of 10 people, are able to have different ceremonies and stuff done. How does that boil down to, like, the family unit? Is there stuff that the family unit I don't know, is unique, I guess, in the Jewish faith, or is there anything, or how important, I guess, is the family unit, is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think it's important in the sense of I think the family unit is important in the sense of that's where we locate the primary. That's the primary focus of child rearing, for example, right? And where we see the most direct transmission of values and practice and tradition. Again, I don't want to say this at the exclusion of others, but I think that's how. I think that Judaism isn't different from other faiths or other more means of social organization that puts that relationship to be primary. At the same time, I think that there are, and I think too, related to that, Judaism is, while there is that emphasis on community, as we've spoken about, there are various aspects that are meant to be done in the home, right? So that there's a large part of Jewish practice that is very home-based, and that emphasis on the home as a sacred space, as well as the synagogue, is an important value as well. So if we think about for example, the weekly observance of the Sabbath, of Shabbat, is in many ways, while there are synagogue services that go along with it, in many ways it's a home-based observance that one is meant to invoke those ideas of rest and renewal and taking a pause from our daily lives and live that out in their home. The Passover Seder, for example, so the celebration of Passover, which is one of our major festivals, that we celebrate the story from Scripture, the book of Exodus, and the leaving of Egypt and the movement from oppression to liberation. The primary observance of Passover is not synagogue-based, but it's at home through the Passover Seder, which is a ritual meal that we sit around a table and we share symbolic foods, we sing songs, we tell the story, and that the primary observance of this major holiday is specifically in the home and not the synagogue. I think is powerful. Now again, who comprises the home and who makes that up, I think can vary, and I think that's has traditionally been the family unit, but people can come together in different ways and form those family units in different ways as well. And I think that I want to honor that as well. I think that there's a spirit, because the values of what people get out of family can be created in other ways. But just recognizing that, I think that there is that element to it, that it isn't, that there is different levels of social interaction that we need to inform our lives, that we're not just individuals, we're not just part of a larger community or congregation, but that these smaller units, family, friendship units, however make that up, is also an important part of our spiritual lives and our spiritual development.
Yeah, this has been a really fascinating talk. I think what I've learned a lot here is that it's not just the spirituality that's important with the Jewish faith, but there does seem to be a really great emphasis on those other different aspects. Like there is the individual, but there's also the family, and there's also the community, and it kind of has these interchangeable parts with it, which is really interesting to think about. Is there anything I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about?
I guess I would just add that I think that a lot of these things, I mean, we've talked a bit about how some of these traditional structures that are valued within Judaism and within other traditions as well are being maintained, but maybe in different ways, right, in terms of how they are. And I think that's true also, I didn't say this specifically, but I think that's also true when it comes down to synagogues, to congregations. I think that there are different ways of doing community that are emerging that I think are very interesting and related in part to larger societal trends of values people see in organizing, or how people come together, especially with the onset of social media, right? Different ways that people can organize or form community, even just virtually, and the importance of that. Or where people find their learning and wisdom has been much more democratized as well. And so I think that these are all trends that we're still figuring out. But I think that all of these, when we look at these different aspects of how we come together and the importance that they bring to our lives, it's continually evolving as well. So now how we talk about how people are overwhelmed by social media, and how there's people talk about how it actually inculcates depression in people because they see it's a curated life that people put on there, and that then breeds discomfort or depression in other people because they're comparing their own lives to that. On the other hand, too, it could be a very powerful way of people coming together and expressing support and reminding people that you're being thought of. And so I think that there's a lot with that as well. And I think that that's something that's still continually evolving, in terms of what that might mean, and how that impacts how we gather together just in general, and how we gather together is in the sense of spiritual community. And what does that mean for our relationships? And it almost still feels too early to say what those impacts are going to be. But that's a whole added aspect that I think nobody, and especially not religious tradition, could have anticipated, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
It's definitely going to be an interesting next 25 years, that's for sure. I'm glad that we ended with social media, because if people were interested in finding you some way on the internet, is there a way to do so?
Oh, yeah, that's great. So, so I have a website so it's primarily my blog, and it's rabbi360.com. So Rabbi, R-A-B-B-I 360. And there you can also find, I do run a podcast myself. It's called Torah TLDR, which is very short, 1-minute teachings each week on the weekly Torah readings, scripture readings. And that can be found on my website or on iTunes or various places as well. And I also have a web series called Carpooling with Rabbi that you can find on YouTube.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I really like the TLDR stuff that you were doing. I thought that was really great, short little content. That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been fun to do. It's been a great practice. I mean, I really enjoy the that podcasting medium, and that sort of gets into the, going back to what we were talking about, how we do community. I recognize that I could. I started doing it because obviously each week at worship service, I do a little preaching and teaching, and I recognize that that's to those people who are there in that room. But are there means to really expand that beyond that? And so I've been finding the podcast to be a real great way to do that, and to try to keep it short, so hopefully people will listen.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Perfect. All right. Assumptions is produced by Kyle Marshall and Daniel Melvill Jones. This episode was edited by Kyle Marshall. Our thumbnail was created by the always great Chris Taniguchi. Most of the music in this episode is from the band the Parson Red Heads. You can check out their music anywhere digital music is available. If you want a full rundown of the articles and media that we referenced, check out the show notes that Daniel puts together that are attached to this episode. It's always a great document that he puts together. Thanks again for listening to The Credits. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks.